It's good to have you in the studio here just before Christmas to talk about some Christmas traditions. Jim, you can remember a time when it wasn't really Santa Claus, isn't that right?
That is right, Walter. When I was growing up, a very small boy actually, Daddy Christmas was the term. We would never have thought of speaking of Father Christmas or Santa Claus. And Daddy Christmas was the name, and I well remember one of my very early Christmases that Daddy Christmas fell down our stairs. What happened was that I had requested a blackboard and easel from him. And on Christmas Eve night I went to bed very expectantly. But I was woken up about 1 o'clock in the morning with a terrible crash on the stairs. And I rushed out and I found Santa at the bottom of the stairs, and the blackboard and easel had fallen over the top of him. Now, I looked at Santa and he had a slight look of my brother. But I didn't say this to Santa because, I was afraid. I was told if you speak with Santa at all, he won't come back to you. So I banished the thought, and of course it wasn't my brother at all. It was Santa. But I felt a pity of him.
This is one of the things that was often a big problem for parents, getting presents into the house before Christmas Eve or maybe on Christmas Eve without the children seeing it.
This is indeed so, because if you can imagine too, in older times, houses weren't as big as they are now. So you had this problem even of storage of presents, which you don't have today. There's much more room and 3 or 4 different rooms to do all this sort of thing.
And I'm afraid, because I had 3 brothers and a sister, there were 5 of us, and it wasn't unknown to go around looking on the tops of wardrobes a few days before Christmas, just in case.
Yes, of course, of course.
I'm wondering, Josephine, what's your earliest Christmas memory?
Well, like Jim said there, Walter, we didn't say Santa Claus either. We would have said Santa or Santy. People would have said, what are you getting from Santy this year? I remember Christmas Eve in our house at home. Naturally, we had no television in those days. We would all have been listening to the radio round about 5:30 in the evening. Santa Claus was on the radio at the time, and he would have been calling out all the names of the children whom he would have been calling at their houses on Christmas Eve night. And we would have been listening intently. You wouldn't have heard a pin drop as he called out this name, that name, and as soon as he would have called out one of the names of myself or my brothers or sisters, we cheered and said, oh, he's coming tonight. And then, of course, parents would have said, well, now you better get to bed early, because if you're up or if you're even awake, he won't leave you anything. So this was a great incentive for us to get off to bed as quickly as we could and hide under the clothes, trying to get to sleep so as to make sure that Santa didn't know that we were awake or anything like that.
That was probably the most difficult night of the year to get to sleep.
Oh, it was very, very hard, very, very difficult. And in fact, I remember even the next morning being sure that I had heard Santa and his reindeer leaving. I was so sure that I had heard the bells.
Did you hang up a stocking?
Always. Stockings were always hung up either at I think it was round the chimney side, because we would have had an open fire firstly, and then of course we had the range. Now, I know that we would have got lots of little things, but there was always the apple, the lovely shiny red apple, the big orange, and chocolate Santas wrapped in tin foil. These were the specialities in that Christmas stocking.
It's very different today, isn't it?
Absolutely, Walter. I have worked with children for most of my working life, and whenever I hear the presents that they're expecting from Santa Claus, I just can't believe it. And they expect to get everything. In those days, we wrote our lists, but we didn't get everything. In fact, I'm amazed now at how much we did get. But always there would have been a little note from Santa, I'll see you again next Christmas, and we knew we would get the rest of the things next year.
When we think about the sort of food that people buy today, I mean, the shops are full of everything, aren't they? We're spoiled for choice. It was much simpler going back 30, 40 years or so. Do you remember, too, the butcher shops or the poultry shops where everything hung up and maybe dripped blood onto the sawdust on the floor?
Oh, yes, Walter, I've a special experience of that because I lived quite close to 3 poultry shops in Cromack Street in Belfast. And for a week or two before Christmas, you'd have seen perhaps 20, 30 feet up in the air above the shop door, 3 or 4 racks of birds. These would have been for roasting turkeys and roasting chickens. And of course, the man who would have come out, he would have just taken a bird down where it was actually just up there, just waiting on someone to buy it. A person would never have dreamt of buying a frozen turkey, because you even would have seen the birds with the feathers on them. And of course, the more blood that dripped onto the pavement, the better. My father always said that was a sign of freshness in the birds. And of course, people didn't, as well as that, sometimes people didn't even have the money to buy a roasting bird. They would have bought an older hen and they would have cooked it with a big pot of soup on Christmas Day.
A boiling fowl.
Yeah, exactly.
It's certainly, if somebody tried to hang up turkeys today, I think health and safety would be after them very quickly,
exactly.
Wouldn't it?
And certainly it is not considered hygienic today, but people come still from all over the city to look at those 3 shops, or where those 3 shops were, because the sight of them, there's one painting of them even in one of the Belfast yearbooks as a memento of times gone by and what it used to look like.
Do you think that the sense of a family Christmas was much more important then?
It was very, very much so, Walter. I mean, you wouldn't have got, for instance, people going out to hotels. I can understand today a busy mother, a working mother, a professional lady going out to an hotel, and it takes all the strain off her to some extent. But that would have been unheard of. And of course, that's very much tied in with today. There's a lot less religious emphasis on Christmas. When I was a young boy, for instance, we had a rule in my own faith where we fasted and abstained from meat on Christmas Eve, which meant you enjoyed the festival, such as it was, the very next day. So you get up on Christmas morning very bright and early because you wanted to go, you wanted to get up early. And I remember even getting up and going to church at 6 o'clock on Christmas morning and saying to myself, gosh, 6 hours have gone of this day already. There's only another 18 left.
You were talking, Josephine, about listening to the radio too, because when you think back to the Christmases where there wasn't television, and certainly there weren't videos, there was a lot of family entertainment too, wasn't there? There was entertainment in the family, the games that people played. I mean, I'm thinking of my own family. We had some extraordinary games because there were 5 in the family, 5 children, and I had a lot of cousins, and we always got together, so there might have been 20 children in the house. And we would put a rug on the table, and we used to play tiddlywink rugby of all things. It was an extraordinary game, a lot of fun, and everybody got involved in that.
Absolutely, Walter. I remember in our family we were always playing snakes and ladders, Ludo, those sort of board games, and lots of card games. And no doubt at Christmas we would always have got a pack of cards. And in fact, my mother would have been very angry if we were fighting over any of the particular games, or maybe if we were saying, "Oh, I should have won that game," and she would have been quite cross with us. But as well as that, Walter, as well as entertainment, we had the mummers in those days. In County Fermanagh, where I lived, they were a band of strolling players who came round from one area to another, and they kept everybody amused. That is, if they were allowed into the houses. Now, there might have been about 8 to 15 players in a particular troupe, and they would have come to your house, this is during the night or in the evening to night time, knocked on the doors, but you would have heard the accordion music before they came to the door, so that heralded...
You knew who was arriving.
Oh yes, yeah. That heralded their arrival. Now, you might have heard a day or two beforehand that they were on their way, because these people, they walked for miles every night going round the different houses, so you would have known they were on their way. And depending on what was going on in the house at the time, were they allowed in? I mean, at that time, the kitchen cum living room, there were a lot of things going on. Children were maybe getting washed or ready for bed. There was cooking going on. So in those times, it wouldn't have been suitable to allow maybe a band of 8 to 15 people into your house, which wasn't over big. But if you did have the space for them, they were welcomed into the house, and a play-a-lit ensued, and it was really good fun, particularly for the adults. But for us children, We were absolutely terrified of them because it was their attire, really, which really frightened us.
And it was very stylised, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Walter. And we might have known these people in the daytime, but whenever they donned this garb, which was principally made of straw, large straw pointed hats, straw round their waist, straw round their boots or their Wellingtons, and maybe sticks hewn out of a tree or a sword. I mean, it did frighten young children, and we would have flown or hidden in any corner that we could have got over behind somebody's skirt in order to escape.
And the peculiar language too.
Oh, the language. It was rhyming language, but very verbose type of language. I'll give you a few examples. You see, there would have been a captain of the mummers. He was called Captain Mummer. So he would have said, "Room, room, brave gallant boys, come give us room to rhyme. We have come to show activity upon this Christmas time. Act of young and act of age, the like was never seen on any stage." And he would go on and then finish off his little spiel by saying, "And if you don't believe what I say, call in St. Patrick and he'll clear the way." So in St. Patrick would come, dressed suitably. And here comes I, St. Patrick, with my armour shining bright, a true and gallant gentleman and a very worthy knight. And if you don't believe what I say, call in Beelzebub and he'll clear the way. And then Beelzebub would come in with his own spiel, finishing off, "And if you don't believe what I say, call in St. George and he'll clear the way." And then St. George would come in with another spiel, and so it went on until the house was filled with all of these strangers. But during the playlet, a fight would follow, and during which one of the people would pretend that he was dead. Somebody would take the sword and pretend to kill him. So then, of course, there was an old lady. Oh, no lady was one of the characters. She was, oh George, what have you done? You've killed and slain my only son and heir, to see him lying bleeding there." And then, of course, they get a doctor. And is it a doctor? £10 for a doctor? Is there never a doctor to be found to cure this man of his deep and mortal wound? And then in comes the doctor. "Here comes I, old Dr. Brown, the best old doctor in the town. If this man's life is to be saved, full 50 guineas I must be paid." But then that was an awful lot of money. So the old lady would have asked him, "What can you cure? What can you cure to earn that money?" "I can cure the plague within, the plague without, the palsy, the ague and the gout. If there's 9 devils in, I can knock 10 out. Moreover, bring to me an old woman of 70. If she's very bendy, I'll make her straight again." So he was trying to prove his own credentials, and he would, of course, taken out a little bottle, and he said, "I have a wee bottle in the waistband of my breeches. They call it Hokerum Stokerum Alicum Tail. Put 3 drops in Jack's left ear, and if he's a living man, he'll rise and sing a song." And so the dead was brought to life, and the 2 assailants shake hands, and then, of course, the bag is put round, the little money bag, and anybody there who can give money will give money. Now, this would be very good, perhaps even if they would go to a pub and they would get quite a lot of money. But in the houses, and indeed I remember my mother well, always having money on the dresser, waiting for the mummers to come, because, you know, whenever they would arrive, you mightn't find your bag or your purse, so she would always have it ready for them.
I would imagine that those traditions of the mummers go way, way back in time, don't they? Centuries, Walter,
and actually they came from northwest England, Lancashire originally, and today there are still groups of men like that. They have different names now, not always called mummers. In Ireland, mostly mummers, but they can be known as the Straw Boys, the Wren Boys, the Christmas Rhymers, which is obviously at this time of year is what they would be called.
Do you think that there were very big differences then in the way that Christmas was celebrated between town and country?
I do, Walter. I well remember that certainly in the town, the Christmas season was quite short, relatively short. People worked right up to Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve was generally a full working day to say 5:30 or 6 o'clock. And then I would remember again, when I started off working in government service, you had either Christmas Eve off or Boxing Day off. You didn't certainly have the both of the days off. And this is why you used to get people, doleful people, often saying to me, at 7 o'clock on Christmas night, and I used to always feel very sad about it. They would say, Christmas is as far away as ever. Because they never imagined that they were thinking of Christmas in terms of one day, because they had so hard to work, whereas now it's the season. I remember the radio announcers talking at, say, 11 o'clock on Christmas night, and they would say to people, Happy Christmas. And I would say, heavens, he's talking a lot of nonsense, your Christmas is gone. Mm-hmm. And yet, as I say, they were aware of the whole season of Christmas, where we were just aware of the one day.
Which really relates in a way, doesn't it, to what a lot of people have been talking about recently, and that is how concerned many people are that Christmas starts far too early. It starts Halloween time, or even before.
Yes, as soon as the Halloween decorations are taken down now, the Christmas decorations go up in some places. And whilst I realise that for commercial purposes things have to be sold, but I still think that it is a bit too early, Walter. I think if you can leave it to December and the Christmas spirit comes in gradually.
Pantomime too. It's interesting that it still exists to this day, even in this more technological age. Children particularly love to go and see real characters on stage, don't they?
Very much so. We were just at the pantomime last week, and I was amazed at the differences there again, with all the spectacular stuff that you see, with the sound effects today that you can have, much more sophisticated. When I used to go to pantomime very early on, it was like a sort of a Punch and Judy show. Nowadays there's much more the idea of things flashing and plopping and all sorts of weird characters. I mean, Jack and the Beanstalk there, we would have never seen the giant that appeared just last week to me in the Opera House. The marvellous technological feat of that. But yet, in our own time, we enjoyed it just as well as the youngsters do today. Again, in schools today, I would have remembered going into school and just stopping a day or so before Christmas, and you would have been lucky if you had a little party 15 or 20 minutes before the end of the normal school day. The teacher would have handed you out perhaps 2 Danny Boy sweeties, and you may have been asked to bring in your own lemonade. And now today there's plays, and there's all sorts of playlets and plays, and their own pantomimes are done in schools. Schools today actually have got into the habit of, I think, starting Christmas too early in many ways. Another thing I used to find, Walter, and Jutta is going to talk also about presents, about the shops giving presents long ago. You know, I remember that Christmas was a time of weddings. A lot of people, when I was a young boy, as an altar boy, we looked forward to St. Stephen's Day. I was speaking with an elderly man this morning, a man about 80, and he said when he was married on St. Stephen's Day, there were 22 other couples married at the same time.
That's amazing. Now, that is probably not true today, is it?
Not at all, because, again, we have all the razzmatazz, we have all the speciality of one day, we have all the flash bulbs, we have all the idea of the expense of an hotel. People very often, when I was a boy and watching ceremonies, just 4 people would have turned up. It wasn't nearly tradition for the fathers and mothers of the bride and the bridegroom to be at the wedding at all. And of course then they repaired perhaps to the bride's house to have the wedding breakfast. Or I was looking very recently at a man's wedding reception bill, and he entertained 16 guests in the Whitehall Cafe in Ann Street at 5 shillings a time.
That's right. One of the big differences between then and now.
It certainly is, Walter.
What about in the shops then, Josephine?
Yes, Walter. Well, in the village where I lived, there was a number of shops, and we would have been shopping throughout the year in these shops for different groceries and different items. And at Christmas time, they would have given each family a present. And this present would have consisted of maybe tea, sugar, maybe a nice fruit cake or a fruit loaf. a bottle of cordial or maybe a tin of fruit as well as that. And this was given free to everybody who was shopping there throughout the year.
Yes, that was a thank you to regular customers, presumably.
That was right, yes. And it was very much appreciated and expected at that time. But of course that has long since disappeared.
Today, of course, when you look at people's shopping trolleys in the supermarkets, you see them laden with things. Boxes of sweets and chocolates and bottles of drink and everything. It was much simpler, wasn't it, in the past?
It was much simpler. Food, certainly people enjoyed their food at Christmas. People would have said, yes, it was a great Christmas. It was because they had plenty of food. But the food was plain fare insofar that you had your bird, let it be a goose or a turkey. Then you had your stuffing, you had the vegetables, lots of potatoes, roast potatoes, mashed potatoes, and your pudding, which would have been made early. The puddings would have been made at the end of November, beginning of December, and would have been maybe wrapped up in muslin and kept there, just as it were, to be fresher by the time Christmas came. And people made their own trifles, and these were beautiful as well. But apart from that, and the fruit, there wasn't as much food consumed as there is today.
And certainly, I mean, there were many houses where if there was drink at all, it might have come out at Christmas, a little bit of drink. It's rather different today, isn't it, in a lot of houses?
That's right. Yes, there would have been maybe a drink given in some houses at Christmas, not every house. But that brings me to a little story. Walter, I remember many, many years ago, he was a very kind, very good and much loved postman. And at that time of year, people would have given him a little treat on Christmas Eve morning. But I mean, that was a heavy morning of post, because a lot of people left their postcards and everything on their Christmas cards until Christmas Eve to be delivered. And I think he went to a number of houses, each of which had given him a little treat, and by the time he reached maybe 7 or 8 houses, he wasn't able to deliver any more mail. So the word came round to everybody, sorry, no postman today, but you'll get your letters up at the corner. He had left his bag up at a particular corner, which everybody knew about, and they went there, everybody got their letters. Nobody was missing any letters, and there wasn't any more word about it.
Nobody said a word.
And nobody said a word, exactly.
My abiding memory of Christmas was around about the mid-1950s. And again, it's partly for religious significance, because we had a priest in the parish that I was in, Father James Dean. And at that time, Harry Belafonte had just recorded his Mary's Boy Child, and it had gone to the top of the hit parade. And Father Dean, after his Christmas sermon on Christmas morning, just struck into Mary's Boy Child from the pulpit, and he had everyone else in the congregation singing it along with him. And that sort of memory has remained with me forever and a day.
Thank you very much, both of you, and can I wish you a very happy Christmas to you.
Same to you,
very
Walter.
Much same to yourself, Walter, and all the listeners.
Jim and Josephine O'Hagan, comparing Christmas then and now.
Come
That was the Shepherd's Pipe Carol, sung by the Clare College Choir, with the orchestra conducted by John Rutter.